Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring Long-Term Forest Health and Resiliency. This is the fourth installment of the Northern Forest Center's Today's Forest Economy webinar series that examines current trends, innovations, and challenges for the wood products industry and the Northern Forest region. 3 leaders will discuss their work in demonstrating the importance of forest management for long-term health and resiliency during an age marked by climate change and development pressure. We'll discuss what this means, both in theory and in practice, why it is important, and what challenges and successes they have experienced. My name is Kendall Gray, and I am the Program Assistant for the Northern Forest Center. I support the Center's forest economy work from regional wood heat marketing and education to place-based forest stewardship project planning and much more. Before we begin today, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. In the chat box, please tell us who you are, as well as where you are from, and name a forested area that you enjoy spending time in. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared in the follow-up email. You can also find it on our website. If you have any tech issues, please message me directly in the chat box, and we encourage you to drop your questions into the Q&A function as we have time at the end of the webinar for questions. I would like to now transition to Julie Renaud-Evans, who will be today's moderator.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Renaud-Evans, and I am a program director with the Northern Forest Center. I lead the center's work in forest stewardship, including our community forest program. I think we hear the words resilient, resilience, and resiliency a lot these days. We hear it in the news in terms of people, perhaps those in places of tragedy or war. We hear about it in the context of communities. Maybe they're facing natural disasters and the results of flood or wildfires. Today, we're going to talk about forest resiliency, and specifically in our Northern Forest region. Perhaps you've thought about forest resiliency before, perhaps regarding climate change or invasive species, extreme weather events, changes in land use, even heavy logging. These all represent changes in our landscape. So today we're bringing together 3 guests to help us discuss this. We have Dr. Ali Kosiba from the University of Vermont, Kevin Evans from Dartmouth College, and Steve Tatko from the Appalachian Mountain Club. Together, we will explore their understanding of forest resiliency, how they think about it, and how they address it in their own work. They'll share examples and experiences for on-the-ground management applications. We'll first start with each of our guests giving a short presentation. We'll follow that with conversation, which I will facilitate, and then we'll finish up with questions from you. And as Kendall stated, please submit your questions into the Q&A for our consideration at the tail end of the webinar. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to them all. We are going to start today hearing from Ali Kosiba. Ali is a forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at the University of Vermont. As the extension forester, she creates resources and conducts applied research to help landowners, foresters, and decision makers better understand the impacts of climate change and other stressors on Vermont's forests and management techniques to improve forest resilience. Ali serves as a regional educator on forest carbon science and management and is the state lead on the Vermont Forest Carbon Inventory. She also works on various forest health topics like planning and management for at-risk tree species, land planning for maintaining critical forest services, and forest monitoring. Welcome, Ali. We look forward to hearing you.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Does that look good? Hopefully. Let me know if not. So thanks everyone for being here today. As Julie said, I'm Ali Kosiba. I'm a forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at the University of Vermont. and provide science-based information to folks who need it. So Julie asked, and Kendall asked for us to talk about what forest health and resiliency mean to us. So I define forest health as a forest that is able to provide a suite of ecosystem services, not just now, but into a future that is uncertain and changing. So ecosystem services are the many functions and values that forests provide. So those are things like producing oxygen, moderating temperature fluctuations by providing shade, but also transpiring water that cools the air, things like stabilizing soils and preventing soil erosion, providing habitat to large range of organisms that are in the forest, but also that forests provide us really important cultural values. They're very closely tied to our regional identity here. And they provide us with resources like wood products, fuel, and food. And so resilience is the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following disturbance or change, and to continue to provide those ecosystem services into the future. So this means that the forest changes and adapts over time. And so the characteristics of the forest, the species mixes might change, but the forest remains a functioning forest. So for example, this is sort of a clear example of what I mean by forest resilience. Is if you look at the left, this is a red pine plantation. So the trees are all the same species, all the same age. Because of this, the trees tend to be fairly skinny. As you can see, they have small crowns. All the foliage is really concentrated in the tops of the trees. So this really high competition provides a sort of base level stress to the trees. They don't have a lot of resources, with the high competition and allocation of resources. And it also means that there's often very little going on underneath them. So very little regeneration, maybe few herbaceous plants in the understory, shrubs and things like that. And so what happens, and it happened in this stand, is when the stand faces some sort of stress. So this is an example of red pine decline, which is a combination of stressors, but really started by an invasive scale insect, the red pine scale. And so all of the trees died because they really don't have the resilience to withstand that stress. Contrast this to the photo on the right, also shows red pine. These are naturally growing red pine. You can see that there's some differences in them. They're a little bit more widely spaced. The crowns are deeper, as you can see with how far down the stem the branches are. They're also declining from red pine scale. It doesn't make them resistant to the scale, but what is really important in this second photo is there's other species that exist in the forest that are able to take over when the red pine decline. And so this promotes resilience and allows those functions and values to continue. So the characteristics of a healthy, resilient forest are things we know from research and monitoring, things like multiple species present in the forest, as I just illustrated, but also things like what we call vertical and horizontal structural complexity. So these are characteristics like having trees of different sizes and ages in the forest. So when a disturbance is encountered, there is some variability in the response and impact. Having things like downed deadwood and standing dead trees in various sizes and stages of decay that allow for nutrient cycling, wildlife habitat, retention of water. Characteristics like irregular gaps in the canopy, so not having the canopy be all one height and really homogeneous, having some variability. And we know these things exist naturally in forests, but they take time to develop and time to be created. And a key criteria of a healthy, resilient forest is having successful regeneration of the future forest. And this is something that can be really impacted by other stressors like deer browse and invasive species, or just not having that heterogeneity in the canopy that allows for gaps to be created and resources available for the new generation. So limited impact by invasive plants, is a key, and also that these stressors, when they are encountered, because stressors are natural parts of our forest, they do not cause a catastrophic impact. So sometimes I think that it can be easier to think of resilience in terms of vulnerabilities, and therefore landowners and foresters can think about making management decisions to lessen these vulnerabilities. So it's really about reducing risk, because disturbances occur, stressors occur, but you want to reduce the risk of catastrophic impact. So I break these up into sort of these three main buckets to help think about these stressors in the woods. So the first are conditions that affect the regeneration of the future forest. So I mentioned things like invasive plant populations, extensive animal browse, or just sort of a lack of tree seedlings and saplings in the understory, or maybe just one species present. And that second bucket is conditions of the trees, overstory trees, that suggest they may be less resilient to extreme disturbances and events. So that are things like trees with small crowns, closely spaced together, of a similar size, a similar species. And the third bucket are conditions of the forest that affect the soils and water quality. So soil erosion or rutting in the woods, exposed soil that's not covered in leaf litter, or a lack of dead wood, standing dead trees that allows for that nutrient cycling and water retention. As Julie mentioned, this is really the work that I focus on, is forest health and resiliency in a changing climate. So I do have resources that I create with other folks as well, for landowners, professionals, and the like. And I do statewide planning and best management practice establishment, as well as research and monitoring, to help answer these important questions we have in our region. And was asked to talk about what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. And I think as far as challenges, the biggest issues we face are just getting folks to recognize the value in doing this work, and then having the funding to do this work, because it is a little bit of a shift in how we've traditionally thought about forest management, and also the time in which it takes to do this work. Right? Forests develop slowly, and we have many forests in our region that are in need of management to promote their resiliency and reduce these vulnerabilities. But I am pretty optimistic about our future. I will say forests are really more important than ever, and folks are recognizing that, which is very exciting. I think landowners are getting a lot more interested in thinking about ecology in their forests, and there is a growing funding source to help landowners do this work. We're seeing development of new wood markets and creative ways to use wood products, which helps in a number of ways. It helps to fund this work, and it has other benefits to support our local economy. And so really, you know, I see managing forests for resiliency not only helps the forest, but it really does help promote resiliency in our broader communities. And so it's great to see that there's so much interest and excitement in doing this work. And I will pass it on.
Thanks, Allie. That was a great foundation for our discussion today. Really appreciate that. Next up, we have Kevin Evans. Kevin is a licensed forester and has managed over 40,000 acres of timberland for Dartmouth College for 30 years. This includes responsibility for the 27,000 acre Second College grant property in northern New Hampshire, owned by the college since 1807, and managed for the three priorities of education and research, timber production, and recreation. Kevin's responsibilities include strategic planning, harvesting an annual sustainable level of timber, overseeing multiple research projects, and continuously educating students and others about the forest and its systems. Kevin's management of the grant property has received multiple awards in recognition of his commitment to a holistic approach and ecological foundation for silvicultural practices. He especially enjoys telling people that the dorm furniture at Dartmouth College is made from the maple wood harvested from the grant property. Kevin?
Hello, and let me share my screen too. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that well. And I'd like to thank you for having me here today. And I look forward to talking about ensuring long-term forest health and resiliency. I'm going to talk about it. I think Allie set it up well. I'm going to talk about it from more of a perspective of somebody who's been out there with his boots getting muddy and that kind of stuff. So I believe this is a picture of what I see as a resilient and healthy forest, one that can withstand climate change and natural events and extremes. A forest with many age classes, mixed species composition, and a diverse ecological structure, free from invasives and managed using many silvicultural approaches. I believe if we do that, then we will have a forest that is resilient to change. Looking at it from a manager standpoint, I think planning for resiliency begins with our comprehensive management planning process. We have just completed a new 20-year management plan. We have done that every 20 years since 1947. We use permanent plots to assess our growth, monitor wildlife, gather bird data, and fish population data. We then use this growth data to set our sustained yield of timber that we're going to harvest. And in our 2020 management plan, we decided we would reduce our cut to buffer ourselves against an uncertain future. And I think that that's, from a manager's standpoint, is one thing that we have to start thinking about is looking at these processes that we've used for many years and what that means as things change. In this process, we specifically are trying to continually increase our species mix on our properties, create fatter diameter distributions, and have more diversity. I thought I might describe a little bit some examples of, I think, what we're doing. And we look at this, I think, we'll start at kind of a landscape and forestry scale, and then we'll move down to maybe some more species or timber type stuff. We want diversity across our lands. So we pay attention to legacy trees, dead and down material like Allie talked about, no cut reserves over our ownership, and no cut reserves in some of our timber harvest. We like to plan for the right tree on the right soil. So those soils are very important. We're using some gap cuttings. I think you can see a couple gaps in this picture here. We mark all of our trees to be harvested, and we look at the whole ecosystem as a whole. I'm going to skip over into now maybe taking a look at an example. And the example here will be our diameter distribution for balsam fir and red spruce. And one of the things that we have had to look at and on our ownership is spruce budworm. And so if you took a look, and what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side, we have number of trees per acre. On the bottom is our diameters in 2-inch age classes from our 2018 forestry cruise and our 1998 forestry cruise. If you were on the grant in 1975 to 80, we lost most of our spruce and fir to spruce budworm. So what you would have seen in that 6- and 8-inch category are two big pillars of young wood that probably survived, and then regeneration before that, starting to move along this bottom axis of eventually getting bigger and bigger. We had this happen in 1930, that moved out, we lost it in 1980. And so in our 1986 management plan, we decided that we needed to diversify our age and diversify our diameter distribution. So we changed our cutting practices in these balsam fir and red spruce stands. And over a 40-year period of doing this, we are now seeing that we have a better diameter distribution. We don't have that budworm bulge moving across. And I believe that this is a healthy and more resistant spruce and fir than we had prior in the 80s. Then we'll maybe talk about, I think, some of the challenges with the changing climate. Lots of it has to do, I think, with wintertime, maybe shorter winters, more ice. And in our management, when we're out there marking wood, we start to think about, the way I like to think about it is winners and losers. And if you look at these pictures over here on the left, I believe this is a winner at the top. That is a hard maple tree with a U-shaped top. If you look down at the bottom picture, you'll see a maple with a Y top, got a crack in it already. Those trees are going to probably fall out. If this tree gets iced, that tree is going to break and it's going to fall apart. The other thing we'd also look at in some of our marking is probably trying to leave yellow birch more than we would leave hard maple and beech at times, or how we might reproduce yellow birch, because yellow birch has a branching structure which withstands ice much better. The picture in the middle and the picture down on the bottom right are gaps. We talked about gap management, trying to diversify ages and those kind of things. So gap management is good. The stand on the bottom is some of that spruce and fir, looking at managing more for spruce than we would fir. Good diameter distribution there, and the nice hardwood stand with a good diameter distribution up in the right-hand corner. Challenges. I think one of the challenges is keeping forest as forest. And I think it's all well and good to combat forest conversion to something else. But I feel that once we keep it as forest, we need to think about what happens to that forest. I think there's too much, anyway, in my neighborhood, too much greed and extraction of forest products with no look to the future in forest health. And so I guess I look at that as something of a challenge, but I also see that we have an opportunity there too, that we can do much better on these lands, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to be resilient and have a healthy forest into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a great description of your on-the-ground work up in northern New Hampshire. And now we'll turn to a main example with Steve Tatko from the Appalachian Mountain Club. Steve is the Appalachian Mountain Club's Vice President of Conservation Research and Land Management. Since joining the AMC in 2012, Steve led the creation of the Land Department for the AMC's Maine Woods Initiative. As a licensed forester, he oversees MWI's forestry operations, conservation acquisitions and finance, habitat restoration, watershed restoration, and recreation objectives on the AMC's 100,000 acre ownership in the 100-mile wilderness region and AMC's Northeastern Research Department. Steve is a native of Northern Maine and is an avid outdoor enthusiast, enjoying hunting, fishing, skiing, and canoeing. Thanks for being with us, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you all here. Let me get my screen up and running. Hopefully folks can start to see that. Well, I appreciate the great introduction by Allie and to the topic, and some really great thoughts to hear from Kevin on how they've been managing resiliency on a really wonderful, spectacular old ownership. Our vantage point as a conservation organization and as a fairly new large landowner we've been piecing together this landscape over the last 20 years, is a little bit different. But I wanted to start by giving some a little bit of recognition that AMC has been thinking about at least climate change before we really had a concept of that term, and consequently some thoughts around resiliency really since the 1930s, when we started doing intensive annual data collection on the changes of mountain ecology through air and water temperature monitoring and just temperature data collection, and particularly in the White Mountains, which is what you're seeing on the left-hand slide there. And then we've been carrying forward a lot of that climate research on our ownership here in Maine on the right. So something we've thought about for a while. And about 20 years ago, when the AMC was starting to think about how we might be able to broaden our impact on conservation in the northeastern regions, we started to think about perhaps buying forest land ourselves and kind of putting into practice some of these mechanisms that we'd had experience with in partnership with the White Mountain National Forest and the Forest Service system, and having been able to watch that grow into a successful, resilient landscape in New Hampshire and Western Maine, really since 1918. And so in 2000 and 2001, we began on the hunt for forest land and eventually settled here in north central Maine. This is a slide of the estimated resilience here in the Northeast. With the darker the green, the area is above average resiliency. And so just by happenstance, what happened to be on the market was a large tract owned by International Paper at the time, right here in the southern region of the 100-mile wilderness region, this last 100 miles of the Appalachian Trail. And you can see Baxter State Park here to the north of us. And it's a very sort of intact, ecologically significant landscape that we've been very fortunate to work to conserve. Here's the ownership more directly. It's about 100,000 acres, as Julie said. We bought the last piece of it here this past September, about a 26,000 acre parcel, Pleasant River Headwaters Forest. And really, we are probably best known for our recreational efforts, and a lot of folks don't know us necessarily as a large landowner, but we certainly brought that a high level of recreation, particularly non-motorized recreation focus to this property. And there's 3 sporting camps, and there's a layer of trails that we've built over the past 20 years. But in terms of resiliency, we've started to really sort of right from the beginning, building off of a lot of work that Dave Publicover, our staff forest ecologist, had been engaged with for decades around late successional forest management and resiliency. We started to piece together our concept of how we were going to manage this landscape to sort of conserve the resilient features that were already here. And so we were fortunate enough that on some of the landscape that we've acquired, we had features that look like this, that had they were in a multi-cohort condition, that had strong late successional components like red spruce and sugar maple and yellow birch and some white pine here and there. And generally were in good condition and had strong resilient features that Allie and Kevin had talked about. And so what we were in a position to do as a conservation owner was to set these aside. So these became the core acreage that we've now built into about 37,000 acres of ecological reserves that are no-cut areas of our property, where we believe that they're functionally we're at a state that they were conserving a broad plethora of values in the landscape. But being a post-industrial landscape, we acquired all of our properties from either at one time all of it was managed for the pulp and paper industry, and then transitioned into some investment ownerships. A lot of it was even aged and very young, and the species composition was heavily altered. And so these lands are the lands that we've been largely focusing our forest management activities on, and thinking and viewing our forest management activity as a restoration tool in this really long-term ecological restoration project. And so some of the questions that we grapple with have to do with thinking about transitioning predominantly even age systems into uneven age systems over time, while trying to improve species diversity with quite frankly a diminished palette of options. We're missing some key species across this landscape from past management that we have to try to make up in some way. So oftentimes when we find pockets of species diversity, even if it's poor form, so to speak, we don't have the luxury to go to sort of cull that poor formed individual. We need the genetic diversity to be present on site. So we tend to retain a lot of those late successional features throughout our harvests. And so to illustrate that point, our management runs the gamut of sort of pre-commercial activities. So what we like to think of as sort of early intervention silvicultural treatments, and those are non-commercial treatments that might pull from some industrial practices that have been used for a long time, like pre-commercial thinning of even-age softwood. We've been using pre-commercial thinning to weed through usually heavy softwood stands that had previous histories of heavy harvesting, where we're trying to promote and release red spruce and white pine in those even-age softwood stands, and drop the density of fir down so that those individuals can be released and be established and stay throughout the rotation length, to more traditional treatments, actual commercial treatments like Kevin, along the lines that Kevin was talking about, where we're looking at gap creation. You can see some gaps in that upper left image where we've created some gaps and tried to concentrate scarification by just simply from the actual harvesting equipment to promote regeneration of particularly yellow birch and some sugar maple, to even some crop tree work, crop tree release work in hardwood, where in a non-commercial way, where we're going into even-aged hardwood stands, say in a post-clear cut condition that might be 40 years old, and actually picking crop trees and painting them, and then thinning around those individuals to release them, to create space within the matrix for them to expand and become dominant overstory trees, so that we can start to advance a new cohort of those landscapes. And all of this is also aimed at again, promoting late successional stand structures throughout our forest management areas. So, we have a main goal of increasing the stocking across the landscape. And it was pretty depleted at time of acquisition in some cases. Some of the properties that we acquired came to us with 9 cords to the acre of average stocking. So very heavily harvested. And we're hoping over time, through this mix of non-commercial early intervention treatments and targeted commercial treatments, to improve that stocking to about 25 cords to the acre on our managed lands, and hope that within the 25 cords of stocking that we've promoted enough late successional features that we can carry those forward into subsequent rotations. We also are, as part of our effort to ensure that stocking stays on the landscape, we are enrolled in carbon credit sales that help us finance a lot of the maintenance costs associated with 100,000 acres of conservation land that's entirely open to the public. So it's a big lift to keep access open and to keep the restoration effort going. I also wanted to put this into a broader context that's very important to us, and that is sort of thinking about how our forest management directly impacts watershed integrity, and in particular, how forest roads and riparian zones directly affect fish passage and the ability of particularly cold water species to exist on these landscapes. And so you see in that little inset map, a lot of our property is in the upper limits of the Penobscot watershed. And then the highlighted area is this larger blown up view of the Piscataquis drainage, which is a part of the Penobscot watershed. You can see our properties here on the dividing line between the Piscataquis drainage and then the Kennebec drainage to the north. And so this is one of the few sub-watersheds of the Penobscot that's now currently accessible to sea-run Atlantic salmon for the first time in about 180 years, as a result of a 20-year effort on the main stem of the Penobscot to pull some main stem dams. And so we're constantly thinking about how we can particularly improve the resiliency of our forest roads, to remove barriers to fish passage, to not only return fish to their native spawning grounds, but also to improve forest management in our riparian zones to ensure that these headwater regions remain critical links to highly oxygenated cold water refugia areas that are fed by spring snowmelt from these high elevation areas that you find in the Appalachian Mountains. So because we are at this important transition zone from high elevation areas to main stem river plateaus, those riparian zones are critical. So we tend to have larger than normal riparian zones that we treat as no entry to sort of hold that closed canopy structure in place while we build resilient forests around over time over the groundwater aquifers in particular. And so to date, these efforts have resulted in reopening about 90 miles of spawning habitat on our 100,000 acres just by pulling culverts and removing barriers for fish passage, and then protected the uppermost portion of the west branch of the Pleasant River in about a 20,000 acre ecological reserve free from timber harvesting. I'm sure we'll get to more in the question and answer some of the challenges, but to build off of what both Ali and Kevin said about some of the present challenges that we see in the landscape, certainly, you know, funding all of this, all of our property remains on the tax rolls. That's a strong commitment of ours to the local economy and to just how the economics of the area work. And so it is that's a heavy tax bill every year on 100,000 acres. So the things like carbon credits that help us generate revenue from our conservative management practices help us to put that money right back into the local communities in the form of our tax bill, and to also maintain the forest road network that provides public access to all of these 100,000 acres. Another big concern of ours moving forward is making sure that we have strong low-grade wood markets that we can feed into. We're doing a lot of first entry thinning work, doing a lot of pulpwood harvests that have to have a home to help us finance that restoration work. And so we're fortunate that those markets exist in our region, but that's something that we keep an eye on for sure. And also, I think you're hearing this in many sectors, not just the logging industry, but access to really high quality contractors who are bought in to this type of forest management and see a future that they're helping to create on the landscape. And we're worried about there being a real training gap with an aging workforce and a need for a lot of new young recruits to come in and backfill. And we're interested in helping to develop new young contractors so that they can get up to speed and develop new skill sets to rise to these challenges in a continually shifting forested landscape. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to all of our panelists for giving us a good base for discussion. You can all come back on camera now and we will start talking together. My first question for all of you is actually to ask you if there's anything you want to add after hearing your colleagues make their presentations. If you feel like you covered your stuff good, very good.
I would add one thing only because I know where he giving this PowerPoint, Dave would say this, and I always appreciate when he says this, and I'd meant to say it during mine. Dave Publicover, for those of you who know of Dave, always had this great saying that, I'm not sure if he originated this, but that a bunch of healthy trees does not make a healthy forest. And I think you saw that in Ali's presentation. And I just thought that little tagline might be helpful for folks if they walk away with that.
That's great. Good. Well, I appreciate all of your presentations, very thorough and covered most of our region with the exception of New York. So I have some questions to sort of just start us off, but this is meant to be a conversation. And so you can each ask questions if something comes to mind and we'll just see where it goes. So we talked about this at the very beginning, and that is, why is managing land for forest resiliency increasingly important? What are the contexts of today? What are the future ramifications if we don't pay attention, etc.? So who would like to start with that? Don't make me call on you.
I can go, Julie, I guess. This has
Thanks,
been the
Ally.
longest since I spoke. And I think, a lot of this is based in ecology and forest ecology. So the concepts really aren't new, but the urgency, I think, is more and more pressing because of climate change. And also the other things that we've used this term global change. Some folks use that because there's other things that are happening, right? We're seeing an increase in introduced insects and diseases with global trade. That, especially in our region is a hot spot for introductions just because of ports and trade. And so we're seeing an increase in those, increase in invasive plants. We have things like non-native earthworms. All of our earthworms are non-native. They're spreading into our forest. So we have this range of threats, including the interaction of deer, white-tailed deer in many of our region, interacting with our land change. And so it just makes this urgency and change all that more important, and that we can do things in our forests and have that lens of climate change, have that lens of ecology when we're making forest management decisions. And I do think really, for landowners thinking about this as risk, managing risk, spreading that risk out, having a lot of different options in your forest, sort of similar to like the investment concept, right? You don't invest in one company, you invest in a bunch of companies. With anything, it's really good to have that diversity, so that when something is encountered, the impacts are less.
Steve or Kevin, do you want to add to that? Why are you thinking it's increasingly important?
I think that was a brilliant summary. And I also would add too, that we're sort of, at least locally, regionally, we're at this point where, there's a need to also think strategically about the material needs of our culture. And we're trying to make a transition in building materials. And so, those materials need to come from somewhere, and they should probably come from the best managed forests we have. And we have local manufacturing capacity that can utilize those higher value forest products. But that is largely dependent on our ability to meet that challenge as forest managers, to meter wood out appropriately, to allow society to make those transitions in material culture, and all the while still trying to balance everything that Ally talked about. And so I fully agree. It is about managing and mitigating risks, and being honest with what the demands on the forest are, so that we can think concretely as a community about how best to address them.
That's right. I just read an article yesterday about the global demand for wood is increasing and will continue to increase. We tend to think in the United States about, oh, everybody's used all the wood we need. Well, many other countries are not in the same place we are, and there will be an increased global demand for wood resources. Kevin, did you want to add something to this, or?
Yeah, I just think that we as forest managers, we think in long-term, we think about things 25, 30, 40 years from now. And I think that when we start to look at things in the forest, we've just started to now think about, I think, a lot more about what we do today and what that means 25 years from now when we want to re-enter that stand or something. I just think that before we kind of had this thing where if we did this, this was going to occur. And we now think about, if we do this, I got no clue what's going to happen. And so I think that's where this thing of being more resilient, thinking about having all the components there, we can set ourselves up better for that next entry 20, 25 years from now.
Right. You all touched on this a little bit, but I want to reiterate it for our audience, which is, what are the results we are looking for in the forest itself, its makeup, its composition, its condition, and as you mentioned, Steve, that wood demand, really the forest's ability to provide the ecological benefits, the economic benefits that we're used to. Anything you want to add, or what's that sort of best picture for us?
I can take a stab, and then I'm hoping Ally will, because Ally had such a brilliant slide. that talked about some of these
Or she
conditions.
could put her slide up again if you wanted, Ally. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Steve.
Yeah, but I mean, I think for us, we think about ourselves within this broader context of other large landowners in our region who are doing different things in many different directions. So we think about providing the importance of providing habitat diversity at a landscape scale and at a watershed scale as being critical to our planning for regional resiliency. And so we see our role in that broader matrix of our neighbors as providing an older core of forest and trying to develop that older core, which, you know, allows for a greater species diversity across the landscape. So yeah, there's Allie's great slide.
Yeah, as I can jump in from that. I do think it is this providing these ecosystem services, which, focusing just on one is not what forests do. They provide, if not all of these, most of these, right? And usually when a forest is not doing a good job at producing one of these, it's because of some degradation, some past mismanagement, or influence of past land use history. And so having forests that can provide all of these, and there might be places where we choose to manage to bolster certain of these functions and values. But certainly we're part of the forest ecosystem. We have resources, needs. And as Steve said, we do really exceptionally good forest management here. We have foresters and we have science and ecology, the knowledge to manage well. And so, I would much prefer to see us using our resources locally than simply pushing our impacts elsewhere, because we're going to need those resources. And if we don't get them locally, we will get them from elsewhere, or we'll use other products. And I mean, it's important to note that wood is, if harvested correctly, it is a sustainable resource that has other benefits like storing carbon versus some other products we use for building that are really energy intensive, like steel and concrete. And we have to recognize we have things like a housing crisis. And so balancing our needs in a sustainable way is really the path forward. But we'll take all of us to think carefully about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that slide up again. Kevin, did you want to add anything before I move to the next question?
I guess the one thing I just kind of popped into my head was, for a long time, we always thought about, and not to think about monocultures or whatever, but, we thought about, oh, the best thing that we want is yellow birch saw logs, hard maple saw logs. And we may have stopped thinking about, geez, keeping red maple is a good thing. Beech is it may not be a great timber tree, but it's a great carbohydrate. It is a winner in looking at climate change and the fact that we may be looking at more drought. So I just think that, it's just people have to start thinking about this real change to the way we've been thinking. It's got to be more holistic looking at everything, not just, that nice hard maple veneer saw log. So.
Great, thanks. Right, so I would say that, this conversation about the value of a resilient, healthy forest, the value of the diversity of species, the vertical and horizontal structure, the age representations, etc., makes a healthy and resilient forest. Do we think that most landowners in the Northern Forest are getting it? And more importantly, if we sort of cut to the chase, what are the potential impacts if we sort of keep approaching forest management or forest ownership with an old lens and not paying attention to the importance of setting your forest up for resiliency? Any thoughts about negative impacts down the road to those who don't take this holistic approach?
I can start, I guess. I think one of the things we have to realize, and landowners should not panic, is that the forest itself is very resilient. We have had stands that have been degraded. There have been things happen to them that we wouldn't want to see, and then we go back there and there's a forest coming back. They are resilient and they will come, so landowners shouldn't panic.
Good point.
But I do think that, you know, people are starting to see the forest differently, and I think as we move along, people are going to start to use these different techniques and that kind of stuff to, you know, do better work and hopefully make our forest more resilient over time.
Good, thank you. Steve or Ally, you want to add to that?
And I would say, you know, I agree with what Kevin said, but I also would add that it's, I think back to the kind of quote unquote early days of fish passage work, when people were just starting to think about the importance of the Stream Smart program, when that was rolling out, and trying to think about fish passage in general. And there was real pushback out in the community against that, you know, that why would we do anything different? And so, and that was one example of where that was an element of climate change that was starting to affect people. And so within that the last 10 years, I would say, you know, now people that perhaps were skeptical at first have now experienced, you know, hydraulic events where they've lost road crossings, and so they've adapted. And so I think there's a collective learning process that people are being forced into because operability has changed, hydraulic events have changed, markets have shifted. You know, there's been massive changes that we're not going back in the other direction. And so I think that's helping open the doors to new conversations and enabling us to think differently as a community.
Great. Ally, do you want to add anything or feel like it's covered? Good. All right. And I know you touched on this a little bit in your talks, but let's be specific about if as a manager, you're thinking about how to manage your forest for resiliency, what are some of the easy things to adopt or to change? And then what are the more challenging shifts that are needed? Or as you, Steve, you were good about mentioning the cost of this kind of management. You know, what are the sort of the challenging investments that you face to really work towards strong forest resiliency? So easy things to adopt and challenging things that would be helpful in making a forest more resilient.
Yeah, I can start that off. Well, I would say, first of all, there's no one size fits all approach. Every
Right.
forest is unique, and that's really important because sometimes I think in the narrative there have been, you know, these suggestions of, oh, we should do this one solution across all of our forests, and that's not that helpful and not accurate, right? All of our forests have unique conditions
Right.
that really need to be assessed. So depends on your forest in question, its specific vulnerabilities. I think Kevin said it about keeping forests as forests, that, you know, keeping our forests intact is really incredibly important. We are losing forest cover throughout our region at an increasing rate. Granted, we do have land use trade-offs that we'll need to consider, but that is a really important thing. So if you're a manager, you know, broaching that conversation with landowners about what are their long-term plans for the land? Do they have anything that's legally binding on their land, or a will, or thinking about legacy planning? And then as far as, you know, management things that landowners and managers can think about, I do think the increased precipitation is really a big one and really important. So especially if you have, like many of us, have land that has any sort of topographic changes, so slope, thinking about where that water is going to go. So road infrastructure, we, you know, used to, this is another way we've sort of shifted our thinking. We used to really channelize water and move it off the site as fast as possible. That increases the velocity, increases erosion. Now we realize, let's keep that water in our forest where it's doing good work. So is there ways you can get that water off roads, trails, ATV trails, sugar bush access roads, and get it back in the forest where it can slowly be absorbed? So we have this phrase, sink, spread, sink, and slow water. And so that's a really, you know, great thing that folks can focus on. So I'd say, like, thinking about your management finding those, sort of start with the things that are really obvious, like that. Increasing deadwood is actually, a fairly easy one. You can just drop trees as they are and leave them there. It can help you with some of that pre-commercial thinning Steve talked about, and it does a lot of really helpful benefits in our forests. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of things, and it really depends on the forest in question as far as are they easy or hard to do. And I think the funding source is a really important one. I would encourage folks, if they need funding, NRCS EQIP program does have funding for landowners as a cost share for a lot of this work. And there are some new developing programs coming down the road that I think are really going to help landowners sort of think differently about how they manage their forests.
Great, thanks. Steve or Kevin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to think about, and I think as a landowner or manager, you have to tick off those priorities, because all this stuff does cost money, and there's funding out there that you can go, but you need to start at what are the highest bang for your buck type of things. And I think Steve talked a lot about stream passage, something that we've worked on, which I think has, I can remember when I first came to the North Country and springtime would come, I would probably spend a month fixing culverts and bridges and everything that had washed out. The last 5 years, we have had no washouts, no, spring damage. And I think that was just a 5-10 year thing of trying to get all those things taken care of. And I just think that people also need to think about that. It doesn't have to be done tomorrow. You can slowly work at them, and you can get these things done, get to your most important things and work them down.
Great.
Yeah, I'd briefly add too. I mean, I think one thing that can be hard to conceive of in, depending on who the owner is and sort of like what the condition of the forest is, but, building in late successional features or planning for forest resiliency, you're also improving the quality of the trees of the forest economically. So it is like these actions do yield economic benefit. Granted, it takes a long time. It's not going to be on a shorter rotation. You have to have longer rotation lengths and some real patience. But I think a lot about, for family ownerships or for people who intend to hold land for a long time, you are improving the asset value, and that's significant.
Right.
Yeah, I just add to that
Sure.
in the 1940s, we had a degraded forest too, and it took us 72 years to swing that around. So the forest grows long, takes a long time to do these things, and people just need to know that things don't happen overnight.
A good point, Kevin's a good point. I'm going to mix now sort of my questions with questions we're getting in from the audience. And there are two that just came up related to sort of financial that we've touched on in my initial question, which is, what are the major financial and policy levers, or inversely the hurdles that impact a forest land owner's ability to improve the resiliency of their forest? And secondly, to Allie's point about mentioning grant programs, let me get this in the right place. Oops, sorry. Got multiple lists here. They're curious about your views on other ways to monetize ecological services that forests provide us beyond the credit market for carbon. Could a similar credit market be developed for either improved water quality or water retention to protect against flooding, et cetera? So sort of expanding this question into those, what are the financial opportunities and what are the financial hurdles for sort of this bigger picture? Any thoughts from any of you on that? Oh, wait, one reminder to the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A because managing both that and chat is tough. Thank you.
I could probably talk a little bit to maybe water. Water is a tough issue. I think Steve's picture up there showed it. We happen to be a owner in the bottom of the watershed, so things that occur above and to the west and that of us also, impact what happens down on us. So I think water becomes a much harder issue, looking at those, incentives like a carbon credit system or something like that. So we need to look at that. I suppose as a manager and I have a management committee of people at the college that I report to and I talk to. I think one of the things that we have talked about the last 5 years is that the incentive is that we need to do a good job and we need to have our forest resilient into the future so that we can continue to manage for timber and to have timber to harvest into the future. So it becomes a thing of some of these things I think we need to do, and you can still do it economically and get the timber out and make money at it.
Good. Steve or Ally?
I'd add to building off the sort of monetizing water. It's so tough. I mean, from a regulatory standpoint and just from an intellectual and ownership standpoint, I mean, water rights in this country there's a vast diversity of existence of water rights are not here in the Northeast. They're largely public, which is, I think, a good thing. We as a conservation organization think it's great. The public has ownership of the water. But I will say that there are some mechanisms right now that people can utilize to protect particularly wetland acres and forested wetland acreage. The NACA program is one way that people can, at least in the near term, get paid for a forested wetland easement that, it makes a real difference. I mean, it helps to conserve that habitat feature on the landscape, and that's available to landowners of various sizes right now. And that can help mitigate some of these downstream effects that Kevin's talking about that are real problems. I would say, the people that want to engage in thinking about forest resiliency and long-term forest management in general, there's a lot of good examples of long-term forest landowners out there throughout the Northeast that have been doing this for decades, and they may have called it something different than how we're talking about it today. But that their ability to make those decisions came down to what their overall objectives were for owning that forest acreage, whether it was they saw it as a long-term investment or not. And there are different economic constraints that come with your window of ownership, and those are the questions that people need to ask themselves if they see themselves wanting to go down the path of long-term forest management or managing for resiliency. They need to kind of have a clear answer in their own minds about how long they want to own that landscape, because that's going to make the difference in how they can think about the cash flow associated with that.
Right.
I can build off that a little bit. So I think for the economic part of this for landowners, really, I think as Steve mentioned, and maybe Kevin did as well, having markets for some of these products. So that is really critical. And it's really exciting to see some new innovations in our region for using some of these products. But that is a big thing because if you're doing timber stand improvement, or if you want to diversify your stand, it may mean removing species or wood that really doesn't, can't go into saw logs, can't go into veneer, and it really needs to have another market. And so that can make or break whether a landowner, makes money or has to pay for some of this work. Also, when we think about some of these other types of restoration, like Steve mentioned, the stream restoration is very expensive to do, but really critical. And so landowners can think about pairing that work with a commercial timber harvest that can help offset some of those costs. So I think there is a lot of synergies there. As far as the comment, I would love to see some more payment for practices that promote some of these other ecosystem services. Certainly, we all as a society, as a region, benefit from what forests provide, even if we are not the owners of that forest, right? Oxygen, soil erosion, temperature moderation, all those things. And so that would be great. I personally sort of like the movement away from the credit system and the offset system to more of a payment for practice system. And there are a lot of those programs coming online. They are focused focused on carbon, but with carbon management done well, we can get some of these other benefits as well. So like diversifying structure, increasing deadwood and things like that. So I think those are coming. They take a while to develop, but hopefully in the next year or so, we should see more opportunities for landowners.
Great. That was a rich discussion by all of you. Thank you. So I want to follow up on Kevin's point about a long-term perspective when you're working with forests, and Steve's point about remember when fish passage discussions were new, right? It takes time for people to think about these things, which leads us to this question. At least in New York, and I suspect elsewhere in the Northern Forest, we have an aging cohort of private forest landowners, aging to the extent that we foresee one of the largest transfers of forest ownership in over 100 years. What do each of you envision this next generation of forest landowners will look like? And how might stewardship objectives change? Any thoughts? The next generation of landowners. Steve?
I feel like we should have invited a sociologist to the panel.
Yes,
here.
probably.
But we'll do
Any
the best we can.
experience or thoughts to share?
I think, and just speaking from my experience in my generations, in the generation that's starting to inherit forest land. And so just thinking about who we are as a cohort, we're bringing I would say a bigger, broader viewpoint of why that land is important to us than perhaps the other generation. I mean, I think my cohort's interested in, sort of the like health and wellness benefits of being outside and the environmental responsibility of stewarding these places. And so I think in general, people, and we're seeing this across this sort of the environmental movement spectrum, people are interested in how their individual presence on the landscape affects positively or negatively that environment. And I think we'll see that in some of the new generation of owners. I would also say that, we just went through a massive real estate transition as a result of the pandemic. And so a lot of forest land changed hands just in the last couple of years. And those folks, it feels like there's an element of escapism a little bit, people moving to rural areas to get away from more congested areas because they want to have a stake in a more natural place. And they're bringing different value sets. And it seems like a lot of those folks are also interested in learning about what it is they just bought. So I'm excited. I'm bullish for the future, and that I think there'll be a new opportunity for expanded conversations, hopefully a bigger constituency to talk about these issues with. So I don't view it as a bad thing at all.
That's great. That's great.
Well, I really do hope actually there is a transfer of land ownership, because I'm not seeing that. A lot of folks my age are really shut out from owning forest land because of the costs of the land. And I would love to see more younger folks owning land and be able to have a long-term vision for it. Land prices have really, really skyrocketed here in Vermont as well as elsewhere. And it's just not feasible for a lot of folks to buy forest land, especially larger acreage. And then what we're seeing is that parcels are getting, subdivided, and we get parcelization. It might not lead to fragmentation, dividing that forest, but we do get smaller and smaller parcels over time.
That's right.
And so the ability to manage a parcel gets harder and harder if you don't have a certain amount of size or access to that parcel. And so that is a really big challenge. And then we just have, more and more landowners that are doing different things. So I hope that happens. And I would love to see a bigger diversity in the type of folks that own land in our region.
That's great. Kevin, I have a specific scientific question for you.
So I was just going to add one thing that
Oops.
when we were 30, people said the same thing about us becoming the owners. So I think that we don't need to worry that much. I think things will work their way out.
Very good. And Kevin, the question for you, you had mentioned your 20-year management plan, and the person has asked, is that a sufficient interval for planning? And does this increased urgency, with quotes, for managing for resilience really affect those planning intervals? or affect the flexibility within writing prescriptions? In other words, you talked about a 20-year plan. How is that interval working within this context of managing for resiliency?
Well, I guess we should talk about, we do a major rewrite of our forest management plan every 20 years. We do updates to that plan, which is probably not as comprehensive as the one that we do in 20 years, but we do those on a 5-year update. So even in that 20-year plan, we are going to do an update at year 5, 10, and 15. And so we're watching that all the time.
So therein is your flexibility, taking a peek every 5 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I also, we don't, some forest management plans might go right specifically to stands, like we're going to manage stand 1 and stand 58 in this year, and we're going to do it then. Our plan has a lot of flexibility in our looking at different stands and where we're going to manage. And a lot of it has to do with, you know, we've been managing this for a long time. We're on entry number 3 in most of our hardwood stands. So we were in those stands in the 1970s. We were in those stands in the late 90s. We're back in those stands again in the 2020s. So a lot of our stuff is kind of set, and we kind of know where we're going to be and what we're going to be doing year to year, just from, you know, having done it for 216 years now.
Yeah. Steve, you want to add anything as a manager?
Yeah, I'll say, I mean, I think we, again, just by nature of what we bought for forest land, we tend to inventory every 10 years because it's going through massive shifts right now because it was so young. It's growing really quickly. We're trying to get a handle on if our pre-commercial treatments are making a difference in pushing species dynamics in the way that we hope they are. So we're inventorying every 10 years. But we've expanded the scope of the inventory to look at a lot of what normally would have been considered submerchantable material. So stuff under 5 inches in diameter that wouldn't show up in a normal commercial forest inventory. We want that information because that's the picture of the future forest. So we're really trying to dive into the regeneration and parse out what we need to do or what we can think about for the future.
Great. Okay, the next question is this. How do the presenters feel about converting wood biomass to biochar, which can provide a permanent and stable carbon sink at reasonable cost in a shovel-ready, scalable way to help mitigate climate change or atmospheric carbon removal and storage? Would they be prepared to adopt coppicing techniques as part of their sustainable forest management to maximize the most biomass for conversion to biochar?
I can start this off.
Thanks, Sally. I was hoping someone understood that.
You know, I think where I see biochar fitting in is that it is a great soil amendment in agricultural settings. So we can increase nutrient quality and carbon storage of agricultural soils, which is really critical, using some woody biomass. Using it just as a sole tactic to store carbon, I think there are other uses of wood we can employ in terms of thinking, as I mentioned, some of the other new novel uses of wood, like replacing plastic insulation. So there's companies doing wood fiber insulation, right? Or things that there's even innovations to look at wood glass, so window panes, right? And so I think I would prefer those where we can we get an effect of substituting wood for something else. I know there's been a lot of talk about biochar, or even things called wood vaults, which is like burying wood. I would love to see that it's having two uses, right? We're not doing it just for the sole sake of carbon, but it can also provide other benefits. As far as coppicing, yes, if that was a good, if it did have that multiple benefit for biochar, that might be a good technique in certain forest types. It certainly doesn't not all of our species coppice. So it'd have to be situated in the right forest type.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, new question. To what extent are each of you engaging with your broader constituency? Meaning for Steve, that's your AMC members, Dartmouth, your whole Dartmouth community, the UVM community, to increase the understanding of the complexity of forest management and markets, particularly in the face of the many voices that do not want trees to be cut right now? How are you engaging in those broader communities?
I'll take a stab at this. So, I mean,
Thanks.
we've thought very strategically about this for a long time and worked very hard to build constituency around our participation in the forest products industry. So, I mean, we've, it's been a process of education, right? And I think early on, the decision to proactively set aside the best, quote unquote, as our ecological reserves, those really sort of what we considered to be highly ecological, already functionally working, those lands went away into reserves immediately as no cut areas. And so we're constantly, having conversations, working on education and working on outreach and taking people on tours and having an open dialogue. And that's helpful for us too, to learn what people's concerns are, both from a resource perspective and a recreational perspective. So it's a never-ending conversation that we're committed to engaging with, both with our members and the general public. And it's how we learn. It's how we make better decisions around the resource use.
We try to get in the alumni magazine as often as we can to tell alumni different things that we're doing. On the ownership, I am involved in a rewrite of our sustainability, our goals for sustainability on a landscape and ecology group, and have tried to inform them of the many things of cutting timber and carbon sequestration and all those kind of things. And I think the other thing is that we have tried over the years, for about 20 years, we are doing a refitting of our first dorm that we did furniture in almost 20 years ago. We are redoing that. And this time we're trying to get an article out to the general public and hopefully the Dartmouth community that shows, we actually went up and took pictures of the gentleman cutting the trees down. We went to the sawmill, saw it being sawed. We're going to the manufacturer, seeing it being manufactured, and then we're going to look at the installation of it and hopefully have some kind of an article and some kind of a thing that we can get out to alumni and things like that. Also have worked a lot with trying to get, and I guess I will tell you, one of the stickiest points is architectures, and trying to get wood used in dorms and even in our buildings. Architects have special things they want that usually don't grow in the forest, like 12-inch windowsills, not glued together out of hard maple with no heartwood. You need about a 35-inch tree, 40-inch tree to get that. So we've tried to work through some of those things and just, work with the whole Dartmouth community over time, just try to educate them. And in our first year trips, we do educate the kids that dorm furniture did come from the college grant and they can come up and enjoy that property.
Thanks, Kevin. Allie, do you want to add anything?
I can just be brief. I mean, I've only been in my position since September,
Right.
and really the concept that this position did not exist for about 7 years at the university. So right there, it shows that the university does have a nod and understanding of the importance of extension forestry. So that is great. Most of my work is really sort of broader than the university, but it circles back and touches on a lot of things. And I do a lot of work at the state level, and I think that is really impactful, is working with state policymakers and thinking about and educating them on the science of forests and climate change and management decisions, because that's really where it percolates into policies and laws and things like our current use program and all sorts of implications from that.
Certainly an ongoing challenge for all of us to keep up that messaging work, right? Steve, a question for you. What means do you employ to recruit loggers into the new harvesting systems on AMC lands?
I mean, I think to take a step back, I mean, we've worked with lots of contractors. I myself was a cable skidder logger through high school and college, so I understand a bit about that world. In general, I would say the logging community is invested in doing a good job. They want to provide you with a good service. And so, we think about that relationship in trying to set them up for success. So, I mean, we try to make sure that, we're putting them in stands that they can economically make viable for their operation. We try to make sure that it's the best fit for their equipment. And we try to be upfront about expenses, both ours and theirs, to make sure that we can set rates in a reasonable way. But it's, again, they're struggling to find butts to put in seats, to put it bluntly. I mean, there's a real labor shortage out there, folks that just don't understand the breadth and scope and real skill that's involved with that craft and profession. I think if more people understood just how technical the logging profession is and the plethora of knowledge sets that you have to make an operation work, maybe there'd be more interest in that. I don't know, but certainly I don't have a silver bullet here for how we're going to reinvigorate the logging industry, but we're open to exploring creative solutions and being supportive as best we can as a large landowner.
And a follow-up question from a Maine logger: how do we balance the cost of reduced harvesting when the cost to operate is increasing daily and we're still trying to promote the forest industry? So any wisdom any of you have would be great to hear. It's expensive to harvest wood, right? And markets aren't strong in some places. And so Steve, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think it's kind of and you heard Kevin talk about this too. I mean, kind of like adjusting harvest levels at a level that is sustainable over the long term in terms of the output. So it's sort of, we're kind of like trying to right size our annual allowable cut so that it's consistent, so that we don't go through these boom and bust cycles where people scale up too much and then have a cliff that they drop off. We're trying to provide a stable flow of wood that can support the contractors that want to work on our land base consistently. And that's an ongoing conversation with us and the contractors. And I think that's the best thing that we can do from sort of an open-ended management standpoint, where we bear our book, so to speak, to say this is what our type of forest management will yield, and here's where you fit in that equation. And that's how we'll be able to plan for this, is to just be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with what Steve has to say, and I think we grappled with this issue ourselves back in the late 80s, early 90s, and one of the things we saw was we were doing a lot of improvement cutting, and about 10% of our volume was in saw logs. But we thought about the future, bringing that pulpwood component down, leaving our saw logs out there, and our cuts now are yielding somewhere in the 18 to 20% saw log volume, and that I think can make a big difference if you can bring that saw log volume up. And we should be producing that, and I think in the future we can get that number up into the 25 to maybe 30 in the hardwood, and that'll make a big difference.
Great. All right, last question from the audience. How are advances in technology helping to manage forests for resiliency? How might technology be removing the human interaction with forest management? Are you using technology? And I suppose this applies both to what the foresters might be doing and maybe even to the harvesting piece. What are advances in technology that are helpful or useful? And is that reducing human interaction between humans and the forest and their management?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I would just say, I mean, we've moved into a kind of a more integrated, it's, you know, we try for seamless, it's not always seamless approach where we can generate, you know, sort of accessing LiDAR data. So sort of, you know, really closely defined topography modeling of the topography features that can help us identify wet areas and unforeseen stream channels and things like that. But we, you know, we found that, you know, and also we overlay that LiDAR derived tree heights. So you actually can sort of get a 3D picture of the tree heights in the forest. So you can understand how the canopy is reacting to different treatments over time. But those are great planning tools, and they can sort of help prep you for the field time. So in other words, it better arms you for that, for them going out there in the woods and actually making informed decisions. But where we see technology being really beneficial is just being able to immediately share maps and the LiDAR information with our contractors who are also upgrading. So I mean, and we can pass information back and forth in real time. We can look at the same problem that they're seeing in the landscape and try to, again, kind of make the business of forest management flow more seamlessly so that they can, you know, be more productive with their time. We can be more productive with our time. But you know, as a kind of a, you know, a traditionalist from northern Maine who, you know, yeah, you still got to get out in the woods and talk to people and meet people where they're at and go look at the woods and see what it's telling you and be observant. You know, the old ocular estimation is still a viable forest management tool.
That's great, Steve. Thanks very much. Okay, we are quickly winding down. Kevin, did you have one quick thought on that?
I was just going to say that, you know, for the last 20 years, we've been using cable machines, and we are now looking at, you know, how we're going to move into what I feel is the next generation of arc cutting, which will be, you know, probably cut to length, and I think computers and everything in the cab and those kind of things. So I think you still have to have that contact. You know, we saw the logging operators on a, you know, weekly basis. You're still going to have to get out there and show them things, and everybody needs to get out
Very
on
good.
the ground too.
Thanks. Okay, one quick thought. If you guys have thoughts on this, you can answer in about 15 seconds each. Do you have any advice for landowners or forest managers as they think about managing for resiliency? We've had a really rich discussion today, but one final little piece of advice from either of you, any of you, all of you? Think big, think forward.
I would say get engaged with conversations like this one. You know, go participate in events like this. Go talk to people like Allie. Go talk to people like Kevin. Go talk to NRCS staff. Go get engaged with conversations, because you've heard it here multiple times. There's no one right fit solution for the problems you're facing in your management. So don't be afraid to ask questions and give opinions.
Very good.
I remember one thing that a forestry professor said to me, and that's be innovative and creative.
Very good. All right, well, thank you all for an excellent discussion today. We appreciate your experience, your willingness to share your expertise with us. It's been really great. So thanks too. All right, thanks everyone for attending this discussion on forest resiliency. We hope you've enjoyed learning about this topic. Special thanks to our panelists again for sharing their time with us. And we also want to thank and recognize our supporters, the Northern Border Regional Commission and the U.S. Economic Development Administration helps us put on these webinars. Please be sure to join the center's next webinar scheduled for May 16th. The topic is Empowering Young Leaders, and we will discuss how to support the next generation of leaders in our communities. We hope that you are all subscribed to the center's bi-weekly news digest, where you will get news, updates, and certainly notifications of future webinars. And Kendall will send you a follow-up email, maybe even today, which will include the recording of this webinar, resources that we talked about, links that our panelists think will be helpful to you, and information about future webinars. So at 1:30 right on time, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great day. Bye, everybody.